Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Monday's This Is Not Therapy Hour, brought to you by Effective Artistry. My name is Marie Moran. I'm an executive functioning coach, and I'm joined as ever by Brandon Tessers, LCPC, Clinical Director of Effective Artistry, and Caitlin Miller, LCP, therapist with the practice.
Thank you.
How you doing? Nice to be with you.
Good to be with you.
It is Labor Day.
Yeah.
And we are laboring. This is so laborious.
Very difficult manual labor. It is difficult, taxing, but not the kind of labor that people were organizing to put controls and limits on back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I did see somebody on social media saying, well, I'm not off today because I'm a service worker and office workers need their treats today. I really felt that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, when I was in the restaurant industry, there was always that thing where it was like, today's a holiday, but you need to work or else we're going to fire you. You have to do at least 2 holidays. Or like the hospital where they're like, if you don't do Christmas or Thanksgiving, you're going to get fired. So choose one. And I'm like, cool.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Shout out to all the service workers and manual laborers who are holding things together today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Just to tell anybody who's watching a little bit about the show. Feels weird.
Show.
It is not therapy, same as the title says. It's an open conversation with Brandon and Caitlin. So it's a chance for you to ask questions of therapists about anything to do with mental health. Effective Artistry is a neurodiversity affirming practice. So if you have questions about neurodiversity, this is the place to pop by and put your questions in the chat and I'll ask them on your behalf. So if you're interested in coaching services with Effective Artistry, the practice is based in Northbrook, Illinois. So you can check out effectiveartistry.com. What was I going to say? The practice is licensed to work with anybody in the state of Illinois. And also for executive functioning coaches, we can work with you wherever you are in the world. So go to the website, effectiveartistry.com, and just drop us a message. We'll get in touch. That was that little announcement. So what's been on your mind this week?
Were you asking me?
Both of you. This past week.
I'm asking Brandon. What was on your mind this week, Brandon?
Well, I don't know. Lots of different things go in and out of my mind over the week. I don't know how you feel about mentioning any personal items, Caitlin, on the stream. I'm trying to be vague to get a sense of. Never mind.
We could talk about recovering from. I don't know there's so many.
I'm going to wish you a happy birthday.
Oh, that's a personal item. Yes.
I didn't know if you were comfortable with that. And I didn't.
No, that is an okay personal item. I was like, out of the hundreds of problems I have, which one are we talking about right now?
Yeah, lots of things. I was thinking, let's see, we've been talking about embarrassment. I've been talking a lot about ADHD medication, but also just medication generally. I think that's what we talked about on the stream last week.
Yeah.
I don't know, all over the place. What are people interested in?
I would be interested in talking about something joyful and less problematic. Like, I don't know, like tips for feeling hedonic pleasure in the moment. Because this is not what you said, Brendan, but I have a lot of neurodivergent clients who will say something like, I did this awesome thing and I wasn't quite in the moment as much as I could have, or I didn't feel like I was really able to like savor it. I don't know. Because I feel like sometimes it can be really important in therapy, even though this is not therapy hour, to like kind of learn how to have more fun. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Sure. I like that. What do you think, Marie?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that. Sure. I have been listening to some recordings on Zen Buddhism, and I've been thinking about the concept of I and me and who am I, and a lot about attention and awareness, and the same thing about how to be in the moment when you're engaging in some kind of task or doing something enjoyable. I think a lot about hobbies, but I don't always get around to doing them. I just think about them.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, that sounds fun. Let's talk about that. Just real quick before you use the term hedonic, and I think we can quickly define hedonic and eudaimonic because that's helpful in this conversation. There's different ways of talking about this, and I like these terms from the old Greek philosophy, but hedonic and eudaimonic, different kinds of joy, enjoyment. Hedonic joy is something which is in and of itself enjoyable. The experience, moment to moment, regardless of what it means or what it leads to or what it's connected to, is in and of itself enjoyable. Eating something that tastes good, relaxing into a nice bath that feels nice, seeing a beautiful sunset, whatever. And I'm giving all very sensory things there because they tend to be sensory, but it doesn't have to be that, right? Over the weekend, there was a point at which I was playing a game with my son. We were opening up these random card packs of a trading card game, and he was sitting on my lap, opening them up, and he just goes, "This is the life." That is.
Oh, that's so cute.
Yeah. So hedonic joy just means things which are in and of themselves, in the moment, enjoyable, not because of what they mean or they're connected to. Just the experience is enjoyable. Eudaimonic joy, EUDAIMON. So EU in Greek means good. That prefix means good, like euphoria, right? And then daimon, DAIMON, means spirit, basically. Same root as demon. So eudaimonic joy is joy which is meaningful joy which is enjoyable because of it's good for your soul, good for your spirit. It means something to you. It's connected to something. So that can be things like you enjoy completing your homework because now you have that sense of relief and it's off your plate. You're closer to what it is that you're trying to accomplish, or that you enjoy working out because it gets you closer to your goal. So that's one very common version of eudaimonic joy. But it can also be things which are enjoyable not because they get you closer to something, but because they represent something. So, for example, donating money or spending time, doing service work, weeding somebody's garden may not be in and of itself an enjoyable activity, but it is eudaimonically joyful because it is you embodying or enacting your values of care or community or whatever it is, right? So it's important to get both. I kind of think, just as a rough rule of thumb, you want to get both every single day. There's different downsides to missing out on either one. But yeah, hedonic is the experience in and of itself. Eudaimonic means it's enjoyable because it is connected to or means something else. And things can be both. That's the ideal, right? It's stuff that's both hedonically and eudaimonically joyful.
We have a comment in the chat that says, "I feel like sourcing hedonic joy interrupts executive functioning for me."
Yeah.
That's interesting. Tell us more about that if you can in the comments.
Well, so let's talk about being present. You talk about attention and awareness, Marie. Again, it's one of those phrases that can mean a lot of different things. But generally, when people are talking about being present in the moment, attention is a finite resource. Every unit of attention that is going to one thing is a unit of attention that can't go to anything else. Right? And so one way we can divide up the categories of things you can pay attention to, which is commonly useful for us, is the cognitive environment and the physical environment. If you're paying attention to, if you are aware of things which aren't present in the physical environment but are only present in your cognitive environment, thoughts and memories and concerns and etc., then you're that much less aware of whatever's in your physical environment, and vice versa. Anything that you're dedicating to noticing the physical environment, which also includes your own body, your body exists in the physical environment. That's stuff that's not going to the cognitive environment. So one of the problems for neurodivergent people, especially, is we tend to be, as we've talked about, focused on the cognitive environment. And when you are truly, quote unquote, present in the moment, which is something that happens to people all the time, it means that all of your resources are going to the physical environment. None of them are going to the cognitive environment, which means you're not even really observing your own experience. And therefore, not likely to interpret it as, in other words, if you have a thought of, oh, I'm totally present in the moment right now, then no, you aren't, because that's a thought.
So we have a follow-up response, which is, when I struggle to engage in necessary tasks, I can often turn to eating to not have to face the task.
Sure.
I don't know if that, I understand that eating in that context could be hedonic joy, but I was sort of talking about the context of like things that before you do the action, you perceive them as hedonically joyful. I don't know if that can turn into an adverb, but does that make sense?
Yeah, and I use them as adverbs all the time, although I don't know if they exist in the dictionary that way. But
making words an effective artistry.
Making words is the best. Just ask Shakespeare.
Yeah. Wordsmiths. But does that make sense? Like when I talk to clients about hedonic joy, it's more about like sort of, and this is so like whatever, but planning it sort of like, what are the things that brings you hedonic joy versus like having an executive functioning task, wanting to do it, and then turning to something that is technically hedonically joyful, but in a way that it almost has like an undertone of maladaptive. I don't know.
I'm with you. And I think this is honestly, I think this is one of the most commonly one of the most common problematic ways of thinking about this stuff. The eating theoretically is hedonically joyful, regardless of context, right? If you're eating,
I disagree. Well, not all food, but I would say mostly it's hedonically joyful.
If you're eating, in this particular case,
in this case,
joy.
Yeah.
If you're eating something and you enjoy eating that thing, it tastes good to you, you like it, then it's hedonically joyful. Now, it is possible for something to be hedonically joyful and then eudaimonically the opposite, right? That you can do something which feels good, but which you're like, oh no, this is terrible, I shouldn't do this, which is the opposite of joy. And that actually does take it away, right? It diminishes what you get from it. So
would you say ideally something would be hedonically joyful and either neutrally eudaimonic or also positively eudaimonic, or the other way around? That you shouldn't have something that cancels out the other thing?
Right, ideally, right. You don't want to diminish, because to me, and I think this is important, especially we were talking about exhaustion, whatever. To me, joy is the opposite of pain, right? Pain is a signal that our body generates for itself, for us to perceive, that indicates that the thing which is happening is a thing which, if not addressed, will damage us or even kill us in the long term. The longer we let it go, the worse it will be for us. Joy and pleasure is the opposite. It's an indication, it's a signal that the body makes for itself that is theoretically aligned with, this thing is good for you to do. The longer and the more you do it, it will be beneficial. And of course, our bodies are wrong about that stuff all the time. Things hurt that are actually good for us in the long run. Things feel good that are bad for us in the long run, or whatever. But it should be kind of addressed that way. I think it's important. This isn't just like, oh, reward yourself by having some fun or finding some joy in your life. Joy is rest, right? Like resting and recovering feels enjoyable or pleasurable. If something is enjoyable to you, then it is most useful for you to assume that that thing is restful or recuperative for you. And if you think about it as that you're doing something bad that you shouldn't be doing, you're distracting yourself or etc., then it diminishes the rest and the recovery that you get from it. Sometimes to the point where you get none. Like an enjoyable activity can become completely unenjoyable and actually still just drain you in its own way if you're not engaging with it and allowing yourself to enjoy it, if instead you're just in your head beating the crap out of yourself for not doing whatever other thing you're supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
This is, I think, a big part of how these cycles of burnout get going is rest and recovery is not something you need to consciously plan and do, right? Like your body automatically will do that stuff unless we learn to override it. And a lot of us, especially by the time we get older, into our adult years and whatever, have learned to override it to the point that it just becomes our default. That doing something, anything which feels good, also feels guilty, terrible, bad, whatever. I should be doing something. So you just never rest. And the times you do is only when you really have to. And even then it's not very efficient because you're still thinking, oh, what's wrong with me? Why am I not? I already slept for 8 hours. Why am I not fully rested and recovered after a week of only sleeping 4 hours a night or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
So I think treating joy as not just a fun little bonus, but an indication of this is a thing which helps you to survive, helps you to endure and persist. We're wrong. But unless you have a specific reason to think that you're wrong, assume that it's that. Anyway.
I'm not trying to sound like a series of counter arguments, but I'm getting a little stuck on things that could be hedonically joyful are always restorative. Is that what you were trying to say?
I think that's the idea, but in the same way that things which are painful are not always detrimental to our well-being, things which are enjoyable are not always. The body adapts very slowly. Like, by and large, obviously there are specific differences, but by and large, my physical body is more or less the same as humans' physical body from hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
My cognitive experience, my mind, nothing in common, not at all. Like completely different species might as well be. And each individual person, your body from one day to the next is roughly the same. Your mind can shift from like pure joy to utter despair in one moment. So the body is more stable, but it's also slower moving. So our instincts, for example, sugar tastes good. The theory of why sugar tastes so good is because glucose is the fuel for cognition. Different body systems use different things as their primary fuel source, but glucose, blood sugar, or sugar, is the primary. When you're thinking, you're utilizing glucose, you're turning it into electrical energy and whatever. And in the state in which our, evolutionary ancestors were living, our species evolved, sugar was very rare and hard to come by. So you end up with it being very highly incentivized. Like people have observed that when members of cultures that are still primarily focused on hunting, gathering stuff, that no matter what it is they're doing or where they're headed, if somebody hears a beehive, everybody stops and they go hunting for that hive right away and they break it and everybody just eats the honey right then and there. Very highly incentivized. Now, we know that we have access to sugar in a way that our evolutionary ancestors obviously did not. And we have good reason to believe that eating too much of it is bad for you. So that doesn't change the body's reaction to it of experiencing it as, oh, this tastes good or enjoyable. Although it can, sometimes you eat something that's so sweet that it's like sickening, you get too much of it. But yes, it being joyful does not mean that it is necessarily in and of itself restorative or restful, but it's an indication that it likely, unless you have some cognitive reason to believe otherwise, same with pain. Unless you have reason to believe that the pain is incorrect, that the thing which is happening is actually good for you, you're diabetic and you're pricking your finger to test your blood, the body still thinks, oh, that hurts, but you can override and say no. So yeah, it's wrong. We're wrong all the time. But unless you have a conscious reason, you should assume that it is recuperative.
The thing I was thinking of that is outside of food, even though your examples are applicable because this person is talking about donuts, is like maybe an artist client who has 6 days a week where they're doing shows and they feel an immense amount of hedonic joy when they're performing, but at some point it tips over into burnout, like maybe after the show, like it's too costly. Does that make sense?
Yes, and what I would say, and I know we're getting off of the original thing about trying to focus on being present, so refocus me, but what I would say is trying to figure out energy drives people literally insane. We can't really know what it is, but we can all have a self-evident, like an observable experience of I feel more energized or less energized. And one key part of that is it's more than one thing. Everybody has experiences where I do something and I feel more energized in this way, but more drained and depleted in this other way. So there are different systems, right? And doing something, for example, well, let's take your example of the person doing the show, which might be incredibly restful and recuperative, beneficial in terms of the cognitive system or whatever systems are involved in social or whatever, but very draining for the physical system, the actual like effort being exerted and whatever. I think most people have had that experience of you're having so much fun and get so wrapped up in something that you just forget to eat or forget that you need to use the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
Common, like you're on a date with somebody and it's going so well and you're having such a good time that you just push off having to go to the bathroom because you don't want the date to end, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't say that it means that that's not recuperative. It just means that there are other things which are getting ignored because you're getting so focused in on the one particular experience.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my theory, I suppose, my way of describing that.
So for neurodivergent people who tend to spend disproportionate amount of resources in cognition versus the environment, how can we get these lovely people to live more in the moment when they would like to?
Well, I think one like broad thing is to start at the beginning, refocus it on when you are not observing your experience is when you are fully present in the moment. Because part of what people are looking for and not finding is, I never have this experience where I'm like, oh, I'm fully present in the moment. Because when you do have that experience, you're not observing it to say, hey, I'm fully present in the moment. It's after the fact when you say, wow, I haven't been thinking anything for the past 20 minutes. That means for that 20 minutes, you were fully present in the moment. So don't look for times where you're observing that you're fully present, because observing yourself is the opposite of being present. It's self-conscious, right? Like you hold back. Now, being fully present is not in and of itself a good thing, right? Like fight or flight, in that moment when some car swerves in front of me and I got to adapt to it, I'm not thinking in that moment either, but that's not an enjoyable circumstance. Mm-hmm. Which is part of the reason I think people struggle with this, is because negative stuff takes our resources first. So when the physical environment, for someone who finds a lot of benefit from spending their attention and their awareness on cognitive things, it's quite likely that in those times when something is calling their full attention to the physical environment, and that after the fact they're aware of it, that it was a bad thing. It was a scary thing or difficult or dangerous thing. Mm-hmm. But a lot of, especially in ADHD, what people refer to as hyperfocus is that it's like fully present. Oh, I completely blanked out there and it's 3 hours later and I had no idea.
Is that like flow state? Is that the same thing?
Flow state, peak experiences, being in the zone. I mean, to me, that's what these things mean. Each person, each way of describing it would define it.
I think one of the differences with flow state that's like would be applicable, but not to everything, is I think it's the intersection of having a high amount of skills in the thing you're doing, as well as being fully present in the moment.
I think when people are talking about being in the zone or flow state or whatever, they are always talking about you feel as though you were doing something incredible, right? Like when you talk to people who are actors about being on stage, or when you talk to people who are whatever it is that they're passionate about, and you ask them what it's like when they're doing it, you'll get a lot of answers like, I don't know, it feels right. I feel like it's what I was meant to do. I feel like I'm flying. I feel like it's a lot of this. I'm not really observing myself in that moment. And how do I describe the fact that I'm not consciously observing myself in that way, kind of thing? I think, personally, because again, negative stuff pulls the attention to whatever, but we're talking about the physical environment right now. The other category of thing which would pull all of your attention and awareness to the physical environment is something which is at the maximum range of your ability to do it. That you are attempting to do something which we're talking about in this case, something which is not negative, like not that you have to do it or you'll die, but you're doing something which is theoretically beneficial to you or enjoyable to you if you do it. And what it is that you're doing is at the limit of your ability to do it. So all of your resources are dedicated to the actual navigation of the physical environment and doing the thing. Nothing's left over. So when you walk away from that experience, yeah, it's like I don't care a lot about sports, playing sports personally, but I've definitely had experiences where it's like, oh, I just observed my body, like make tiny little adjustments and movements that I didn't tell it to do, but it put me exactly in the right spot for. It's kind of like you can't imagine doing better than what you're doing. You don't have to consciously, but it just happens.
Well, and it's not in like an egoic sense of like, if I did this thing for another 10 years, I'd be way better at it, but that you're doing it to the maximum of your capacity in the moment.
Right. Because it's specific. That's the thing about the physical environment. It is as specific as it can be. You cannot consciously think anything that is as specific as the specific data that you're getting and utilizing as you interact. Any version of considering it or describing it is some way abstracting it. It's abstract thought, right? Mm-hmm. So, right, yes, you're exactly right, Caitlin. I agree. I mean, that imagining what you might be like in 10 years is abstract thought. I'm talking about in this moment, this specific information. It's like I'm not thinking at all. And so, in a sense, that is kind of, you're not relying on executive functioning, you could say, because executive functioning is that thing which takes conscious intention and then translates it into behavior. And there's not a lot of conscious intention in some of these experiences, or none at all. But another way to describe it would be that your executive functioning is working so well that conscious intention is acted upon so quickly that you don't even have time to notice it before it's completed and you're observing the next thing.
Would you say that if a neurodivergent person practiced being in the moment more, that would theoretically improve their ability to have the intention of doing something and then doing it, aka executive functioning?
Well, certainly the more that it happens, the better you get at it, right? Like if you're thinking about trying to do something without actually executing on attempting to do that, right? If you execute, succeed or fail, you get information, you get experience, and you improve both your conscious like intentions and ideas about what needs to be considered, but also your body's just experience, skill, muscle memory kind of stuff. So acting on things quickly, which I think a lot of what flow state is, and I should be clear, this is a lot of Brandon theory stuff, right? Like this is just my thoughts on things. I think there's a loop. I talk about it as acquisition, arrangement, application, that we acquire data from some source. We then, in the cognitive space, arrange and rearrange that data, combine it in different sequences and pull up other things from long-term memory and try to make, until we find an arrangement which seems useful, then we apply that and do something. And when that cycle is very, very slow, that's like when we're in our head thinking about what we should do for months or even years before actually doing something. Or the cycle can go so fast that you don't even observe the cycle. That logically speaking, you must be taking in data because you are navigating an actual physical environment and are responding to things which are changing moment to moment in ways that allow you to still accomplish whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. It's just data in, quick, and then apply, and data in and apply, and data in and apply. That the arrangement part of it basically either isn't happening or is happening in such a way that we can't observe it happening.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I had some sort of counter argument about cognition and flow states, but the acquisition, arrangement, and what is the application? Are they all A's? Am I making this up?
No, I try and go for things like that to make it easier.
Brandon AAA method. It's not a battery.
I spent a lot of time on those words because I was very specifically trying to come up with something that was neutral. Like I didn't want it to be learning or observing or, because observing is active, whatever. So just acquiring information, not thinking or strategizing, just arranging data, like taking the kind of willfulness out of it. The I do this. It's just what happens whether you are intending for it to happen or not. You acquire data, arrange it, and apply it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I haven't talked about that one as much for a while.
It's a good one.
But your question, Caitlin, about practicing being present in the moment. Here's the tricky thing. You can't. That's the whole point.
I think you can.
What you can do, and what I recommend work with people on doing, is arranging things in such a way that you think that those times and those contexts, those experiences in which all of your attention will be drawn into the environment, that you're setting yourself up for things where you think that will happen. But you cannot consciously make it happen. Any attempt to consciously get yourself to pay attention to the moment it will make it so you're paying less attention because it's a conscious thought.
So yeah, that is what I meant by practicing, is like going into intentional spaces with wanting to be in the moment. So, okay, if someone with ADHD said to you, but Brandon, that's not enough. I need like rules. I need steps to get in the present moment. You really just can't control it at all. I don't believe you. What would you say?
That person, because this one does hit ADHDers specifically, especially because of things about the way people conceptualize ADHD. I would say you already do it all the time, constantly, all the time. And you're missing out on all that information because you have been convinced to think of that experience as some negative thing. You might be calling it hyperfixating. You might be calling it getting distracted or procrastinating. You might be calling it losing track of time, zoning out, daydreaming, getting your head in the clouds, whatever, right? And some of those are definitely cognitive experiences, or at least can be applied to cognitive experiences. But if somebody's saying, I have all this work that I need to be doing, and instead I just kind of zone out on the couch in front of the TV for 2 hours. Well, that zoning out, that was the fully present. All of your resources were going toward the TV, or this is also where you'll get people saying, I put on a show in the background, but I also look at my phone and I also am snacking because I've added up enough stimulation in the environment that it's taking the maximum of what I've got. If I let go of one of those things, there's still a little bit left over and I'm going to be in my head thinking a little bit. But if I get enough environmental stimulation, then I just stop thinking. ADHDers especially will talk about shutting off their brain. I need to get my brain to shut up.
I was thinking about this today because I baked some bread. I don't bake as often as I used to, but today I baked a loaf of bread. And I realized afterwards that I had got into that state. It was a little bit of muscle memory, but it was a sensory thing for me as well. And I just baked some bread without really thinking too hard about what I was doing. And it was really nice.
That is a very impressive skill.
That's cool. I like that. I'm glad that you had that.
Yeah. And the same thing when I'm doing like crafts and things, but I get in my head about having all the right materials and having the environment set up the right way. And that's where as a PhD I tend to get stuck. But once I'm actually making something, hours and hours can pass by and I can look down and I've like knitted or crocheted something that's suddenly this big, and I haven't thought about it.
So I guess, Brandon, where I might challenge you, like with Marie's example, is if, Marie, you were making bread and you felt like very much in your head and you were thinking about maybe like an argument you had with a friend the day before or something, I would maybe challenge a client to like notice the way the dough feels in your hands and feel your muscles interact with kneading it, and notice the amount of flour that you might have to put under it so you can knead it. Notice how the shape it's getting, and although those are technically like cognitive sort of like questions to ask yourself, if part of the answer is focusing more on the task, then couldn't it theoretically help someone get into the moment, even though that act itself is not getting into the moment?
Yes. So what you're talking about is generally we would call mindfulness. And you want to use it in a few different circumstances. The one in which people primarily are talking about it in therapy, especially, is when what's going on in your head is unpleasant. Like the example you just had, right? You're thinking about an argument you just had with somebody or whatever. It's a way of getting your resources out into the environment in order to kind of deprive whatever the unpleasant thing is of the attention it needs to live. Because you can't, just like we're talking about, you can't say, stop thinking about this thing, because that is a thought about the thing. But you can say, listen to the farthest away sound, feel the dough on your hand, whatever, and that pulls attention away from it. So that's about diminishing. And for me, by the way, I would refer to that as stimming. That anything that you're doing which draws your attention to the physical environment with the purpose of decreasing the intensity of a cognitive experience. Something is happening in here, good or bad, that's just intense in a way I don't enjoy. I'm trying to diminish the intensity, decrease the intensity. Doing anything which draws my attention out into the environment, I would call stimming. Whereas fidgeting can be the exact same action, but for me serves a different purpose. It's preventative in order to enable me to focus on what I'm trying to focus on.
I don't know if I tracked your answer to my question or if I even asked a question, which is a great.
You're right. I got distracted with the stimming and fidgeting sidetrack.
Do you remember what I asked? Because I guess the question I was trying to ask you was that theoretically, is that a way that could make someone's brain more likely to eventually get into a flow state or in the present moment?
Yes, and I do think, yes, it is. So that's the other use of mindfulness I find to be valuable, but it's just not what people focus on as much, which is effectively, like, if you want to read a book, you want to get yourself really invested into reading a book, but you're trying to think, what book should I read? What book should I read? And you're having a hard time. I can't think. You're going to have it's a lot more likely you'll get into a book if you go over to the bookshelf and start pulling books down one by one and giving yourself the opportunity to have your attention captured by one of them. Mm-hmm. So mindfulness in that sense is the same thing, right? That if I do consciously direct my attention to the environment, then it's more likely that, I'll be noticing the environment more. And then something that I'm noticing in the environment has the potential to pull more and more of my attention. Something I didn't notice, but now I'm making myself focus in a way, and now I do notice it. And now that I've noticed it, I don't need to force myself to think about it anymore. All my attention just gets pulled. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I was kind of thinking, at least for myself, sometimes if I'm in an environment and I can guess that certain parts of it I would find more hedonically pleasurable than others, then I can do like mindfulness tricks in my mind to think of what is the most visually pleasing thing in my immediate environment and then focusing on that versus other things that might cause more distress. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I absolutely agree. And to me, that's step 2 and 3. That's arrangement and application. I'm thinking about, which is why I'm always, what I was talking about before, what I want to start with is we need more data. You don't know very well what kinds of things cause you to be present in the moment or are more likely to make it so that you are present in the moment because you write off those experiences as negative ones. Mm-hmm. If you, for example, we've talked about distraction in the past is centering the thing which you are not doing, right? If you say procrastinating or distracting, I just distracted myself, whatever. Then what you're saying is whatever it was I was doing, the only purpose that it served in the way you're describing it is to prevent me from doing this other thing. So why would your limited resources, right? Cognitive miser, brain spends the minimum resources it has reason to. Why would you spend any resources noticing specific information about what you were doing and how it felt? Because the only thing that matters is that it was serving the purpose of distracting me from the thing I was supposed to do. So you walk away from that experience really not remembering much at all about what you were doing, only focused on what you weren't doing. And you don't remember the enjoyment you got out of doing the thing that you were doing. You remember only that you weren't doing what you were supposed to be doing and you're upset about it. If anything, to whatever extent you do remember what you were doing instead, you walk away from that thinking it's a bad thing that you shouldn't allow yourself to do anymore. The number of times I've had ADHD to say, I have an addictive personality, which effectively just means I got to be careful about letting myself do things that I like, because if I let myself do things that I like, then it becomes a problem. It stops me from doing other things, which is not, I mean, that's a way to describe things. It's just not useful.
So do you think some of that could be empowering for ADHDers in the sense of like, what about the thing that you are calling distracting brings you hedonic pleasure? And then to figure out, is there any pattern in that, or are there any things that kind of like stimulate your mind in that way? And then to see if whatever the executive dysfunction is, how can we link things that you're naturally drawn to the things that you feel as though you should be doing?
Yeah, that's one application of it, and that's the one that we're focused on today. Is the more you pay attention to what you are doing as opposed to the thing you are not doing, and get the data about that experience, the environmental, like observable data involved with it, or the hobby of it, or the patterns, the better the more information you'll have to come up with theories about what kind of stuff is the kind of stuff that tends to make me get present in the moment. But aside from that, there's a bunch of other benefits too. Like a very common one is they call it the shower principle or the Archimedes principle, various different things of, hey, when you're focused on the problem that you're stuck on, a lot of the time when people stop that and go focus on something else instead, then they're able to solve the original problem. It's something that we all like talk about. Just take a break, like get your mind off it, approach it with fresh eyes, sleep on it, whatever. We know it, but people don't really talk about the mechanism behind it. But what must theoretically be happening is that in guiding your attention to other things, you notice some data in that experience that beforehand you wouldn't have cognitively identified as that's data which will help me solve the problem. Archimedes getting in the bathtub doesn't think, oh, if I get in the bath, that will help me figure out water displacement. But getting in the bath, then the water moves, and that's new data that he didn't have. So creativity and innovation especially, which if you are a white collar worker, your job is about intellectual labor, creativity and innovation. I don't mean inventing new products, although that's part of it. I mean, even just like looking at the spreadsheet and making sure that, wait a second, those numbers aren't right? You've got to connect. By definition, just logically, if you are going to connect A to Z, which no one else has connected, then that means that before you can do that, you must have noticed both A, which is the thing everyone's saying you're supposed to focus on, and Z, which everyone else is saying, why are you paying attention to Z? That has nothing to do with what you're doing. Because if they already knew that Z was connected to A, then they would have told you, look at it. And that's not creating, that's not doing something new. By definition, you have to chase the butterflies around in order to later on utilize any information about butterflies when you're trying to solve something else. You have to do things which nobody else has consciously identified, to you at least, as being potentially relevant to what it is that you're trying to do. You have to collect information, acquire data before you can use it. You can't.
And that's a great way, Brandon, to refute the idea of like the unconscious or the subconscious. Like when you're going on that walk in nature, this question just dipped into the collective unconscious and then it came back out 2 hours later. And that's why the answer, instead of like, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And
I don't think many people talk about what you're saying right now.
That's honestly what your question earlier before too was. This to me is the big problem with the deficit model. It's not that it's mean to people. It's that it supposes as an answer to questions that otherwise have no answer. Oh, because some people are just broken and do things which make no sense, which is not a useful answer. If I'm saying, why is my attention constantly called to this thing when I'm trying to focus on this thing?
Yeah.
The logical thing is to say, well, what is it about that thing that's calling your attention? There's a reason. Not that it's always knowable, not that it's all, we're wrong all the time. We pay attention to things we don't end up using or whatever. But instead, if we say, oh, why is it? Because you have a hard time focusing, you're bad at focus, you're bad at executive functioning, you have ADHD, whatever deficit thing, then we don't explore the actual thing which is happening anymore because it's just written off as a deficit. So,
and I've had that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Brandon.
Oh, please go.
I've had that like transform clients' lives. Like sometimes they'll say like, Oh yeah, I have this hyperfixation on like the intersection of, I don't know, genetics and like chronic conditions, but they're like working as a barista, and it's like, well, what if we changed your life? What if you did things that you liked all the time? Like, so sometimes I think the distracting things are things that actually can, like, if it's built upon, they can really change people's lives.
Yeah.
I feel like I sound like a motivational speaker.
I feel
Sorry,
like
everyone.
nothing wrong with saying things that make people feel good and inspired to do things differently.
Yeah, I don't know.
I agree. I think this is why, like, the concept of should and, the way that we talk about need, it has to be in order to, and blah, 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 is because people spend a lot of their resources thinking about the things they are not doing and trying to theorize about why they are not doing them, where it's much more useful to think about the things that you are doing and theorize about why you are doing those things. But that requires that you assume that the things you do, you have a reason for doing them. And you have been taught that that's not the case. That if you like playing video games, there's a reason you like that. You don't have to know what it is consciously. You don't have to be able to identify it and explain it and justify it to other people. Not everybody enjoys playing video games. Not everybody who enjoys playing video games enjoys the one that you're enjoying. Not everyone who enjoys that one enjoys doing it in the way you're enjoying it. There are individual things. So it stands to reason that there is some process which is determined for you that that is a thing which is enjoyable. And the assumption should be that unless proven otherwise, that it's beneficial to you to do that. Doesn't mean that you don't want to pay attention to balancing things. And I don't mean moderation in the sense of don't let yourself do it too much, because do it as much as it's enjoyable. Except that there are other things which are also important, and make sure you're doing things which are important too. Video games are not harmful to you. Doing things you like, baking bread, Marie, was not harmful to you, right? But if you think of it as, oh, I shouldn't bake bread, I should really focus on this other thing, then you do the exact same thing, but you walk away from it thinking, dang it, I'm so bad, I should not you know what, I'm going to like not have baking stuff in my house just to make sure that I can't allow myself to get distracted.
And now I just have no bread. Where's the fun in that?
And I feel like that could also be a way to rob yourself of the eudaimonic joy of like, how cool it is that I have this skill and that I made this bread today, and like it's meaningful that I can survive an apocalypse because I want to buy bread at a grocery store.
Right,
So
well,
yeah, I don't know.
In that particular case, actually, even being able to eat the bread later is eudaimonic about baking the bread. Baking is its own experience, but knowing that you'll get to eat it, that's part of the eudaimonic joy.
Yeah.
So I could imagine someone hearing you say this, Brandon, saying, I don't have time to experience more pleasure in my life. I agree with you, Brandon, but it's so presumptuous of you to think that I can make my life better than it is and more fun.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that sounds like a person who is about as far into the depths of burnout as one can go.
Yeah.
There are things that we might explore there, but notably, that's where I go back to, I didn't ask you to do anything differently than what you're doing. I didn't. That's why I start with, all I'm asking you to do is to think of the things that you're already doing slightly differently than you've been thinking about them.
I feel like that's a way to trick clients into coming back 3 weeks later and being like, okay, Brandon, I tried enjoying playing video games.
If by trick, I mean, sure, yeah. Because sometimes they do come back and they say, yeah, it's a lot better.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, that's the most common thing that happens after this is people will come back. We talked in the past about Bader-Meinhof effect or Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. It's the phenomenon that once you learn a phrase for a thing or a term or a symbol for a thing, you start to notice it more. Because language dictates where your attentional processes send the attention, right, to some extent. That's what we're talking about. You call something a distraction, literally using the word distraction, and your attentional processes dictate, oh, that is not worth getting information about beyond that it isn't the thing that we were supposed to be doing. As long as we've identified that, we have all the meaningful information, we need nothing else. If we take that away and we don't let you call it a distraction, notice how much I'm saying things which are calling your attention, pulling your attention, not taking your attention away from other things. because we want to get people's brains to focus on their attentional processes, to focus on getting data which is useful. Neurodivergent people have been thinking, you wouldn't identify that way if you hadn't been thinking about how to solve your problems a crap ton for a long time.
Yeah.
The most logical assumption, or at least the highest theoretical return on investment, is to assume that you need new information, not that you need a new way to rearrange you have taken the data you have and you've rearranged it infinite ways, right? Like, I don't have a new way to think of what you're already paying attention to that you haven't considered and either tried or dismissed. Look at how much you're doing with the data that you have. You know, you take 2 points of data and you think about it for 10 years, figuring something. If we just get you one extra point of data, what you can do with that. So the very first thing for me always is, I want information that you don't already have. I assume that you don't have the information you need. You're assuming that too, or you wouldn't be coming to me. But you just think that I'm the one with the information for you. And I don't think that. But I think that the fact that you think that I'm the one with the information does mean that your attention will go to me and the things that I say, which means when I ask you a question that you can't answer, your brain is now incentivized to pay attention to that stuff so you can answer it next time. So when people come in and they say, this is the problem, I do this and I suck at this and I'm terrible in this way, and I say, well, what do you do for fun? And they say, I don't know, I used to like music. Okay, well, what do you do for fun now? Nothing really. I'm just exhausted all the time. Okay, well, but you said you get distracted and procrastinate. Yeah. So what do you do during that time? Nothing really. Just look at my phone or whatever. What do you look at? I don't know. Then they go away for a week, and their attentional processes are now incentivized to notice that, because there's an assumption, even if I don't state it, that it's more likely that I'm going to ask for that information again, and they want to answer it. Because people don't like not being able to answer a question, which sucks. Honestly, it's much better theoretically to be able to say, I don't know the answer to that. That's interesting, instead of, I don't know the answer to that. That's bad. Either way, you'll pay attention, but people tend to feel bad about it, which sucks. So they'll pay attention, and then they come back and they can. I'll have people say, I think I struggled because last year I wasn't mature, but this year I'm more mature. And I just say, what do you mean by that? Well,
I have no clue is their answer. Yeah.
I mean, that's a real one that I was just working with a client that, like, teenage client issues, fighting with parents. They all love each other, but there's a lot of contention over the homework and blah, 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 blah. And this idea of maturity has been central to all of their concept of what's going on. None of them have ever thought about what the hell it means. Which doesn't mean that there's a definition, but when I ask that, now all of a sudden they have to pay attention to different things they haven't been paying attention to. Or somebody will say, you know, if I take a bit of a break before doing a thing, then it's easier. Okay, cool. What did you do during the break? Or last week someone will say, my son is really struggling. He's having a lot of meltdowns. My autistic son is having a lot of meltdowns at school during transitions. And then they'll talk to me about all the things that he's doing, the yelling and the hitting and the whatever. And then I say, well, what transitions? Like, transitioning into what or out of what? Oh, I don't know. And right then it's very clear. Why aren't we paying attention to some things, some stimuli provoke a certain response, some don't. We don't like the response. Theoretically, wouldn't we want to start by looking at what stimuli provokes the response? But because we identified autism as a deficit, we don't look at that, because the assumption is it doesn't matter. It's random. It's about the fact that he's autistic. It has nothing to do with anything else. But you ask
I'm going to force myself to say this. I have to run to the bathroom. I will be back if the stream is continuing. Okay.
Good for you.
I'm forcing myself.
Good job. Good for you.
All right, we've got a few comments to catch up on, and I'm sorry I haven't got to all your comments. The last one here is, somehow it's really reassuring to hear someone assume I've thought about my problem more than they can comprehend, and they probably won't offer a lot of new insight.
Yeah.
To be the expert in your own problems, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, of course you are. Look at, you are sitting here watching a stream about maybe something related to the things that you're struggling with. Like, obviously you are putting a lot of thought and effort into trying to figure this stuff out, or you wouldn't be sitting here watching some random stranger on the internet talk about it, just in hopes that it might be helpful to you. No one will ever think about you 1/1,000,000th of a percent as much as you think about your own stuff. And anybody who pretends like they understand you better than you understand yourself, they're just wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean they don't have information that you don't have, which might be helpful to you, but it's not information about you.
And they've also given us a recommendation. Have you seen any of Dimension 20's Mentopolis? It's wonderful, and Hank Green is a treasure. He's playing the fix or hyperfixation in the brain. That sounds
Really? That is interesting. I've never actually listened to Dimension 20. They're a live play group that I think originally did D&D, but like many of these have expanded out. So no, I haven't listened to any Dimension 20 stuff, but I've heard. Wait, Hank Green is in it?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Also,
catching up on the comments.
Stranger. You're not a random stranger, Brandon. You're one of my favorite strangers.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Yeah, no, if there's one thing I can assume about neurodivergent people, it is that they have thought a lot about how to be better than they are. Now, whether or not I would agree with that phrasing and all that isn't the point.
Mm-hmm.
If you're identifying as neurodivergent, you have spent a lot of your time thinking, what I'm doing, what I'm experiencing, what I'm thinking is not as good as it could be or should be. How do I change that?
Wouldn't that be an irony of some of like the pathological underpinnings of neurodivergence? Like if neurodivergence is supposed to be transcending pathologies, but most neurodivergent people think about things that they'd like to do better for like huge amounts of time. Does that make sense?
Yes, very ironic. But I'm saying people who identify as neurodivergent, not neurodivergent people, because I don't qualify it that way. And by the time someone has come to identifying as neurodivergent, finding some utility in that framework, they've already been through being pathologized or pathologizing themselves. Mm-hmm. And they're looking at neurodiversity and neurodivergence as a new lens that might help them. But again, that's why most people are just talking about the medical model, but using this terminology. Even people who identify that way, even people who are very great and vocal advocates for neurodiversity and the causes of neurodiversity, still have a tendency oftentimes to think of some people are and some people aren't. And if you are, it's because of how your brain is and blah, 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 which is all just medical model stuff. My ADHD makes it difficult for me to blink, but that's medical model.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about that not as a counter argument to what you were saying, but because I think that could be a way to free some people of the way they were still pathologizing themselves, even under the umbrella of neurodiversity.
Yeah, that's the big thing is assume that everything every person does, and I'm phrasing it that way because for most of us, most people who identify as neurodivergent, it's easier to make this assumption about other people than about themselves. Mm-hmm. Assume that everything everyone does makes sense for them to do. Mm-hmm. Assume that everything everyone does is the best thing they could do in that context. And that doesn't mean in order to be able to do something, you have to have the idea of what to do, right? So it doesn't mean that you couldn't later on learn, oh, if I had thought of that, yes, that would have been a better thing to do in that context. Mm-hmm. That happens all the time. But you didn't have that idea or that thought or that information in that context. Everything everybody does is the best thing they can come up with to do. Sometimes with conscious input, sometimes not in that moment. And if you come at it from that lens, if you really do let go of this idea that you can explain why does person X do thing Y with any answer which involves, well, because they're broken or because they're sick or because there's something wrong with them, which effectively is just a cover for saying, because that thing makes no sense, but sometimes people do things which make no sense. Mm-hmm. If you don't let yourself answer it that way, then you have to come up with different answers. And that's the start. As soon as you do that, then you start to say, well, okay, I'm procrastinating and that's bad. Why am I doing that? What is it that I'm doing when I'm procrastinating? Mm-hmm. I obviously don't want to do it, or I wouldn't feel so bad. I wouldn't call it procrastinating. I don't think it's the best thing for me to be doing. I wish that I were behaving in some other way. So it's not about just wanting things or thinking it would be better, which is very ironic, but also the most common maladaptive pattern I see in people is they feel terrible about not doing something or doing something differently than they think they should or whatever. And they come to the conclusion that the reason that they fail or struggle is because they don't care enough. So then they try to care more, but you already care a lot. And then you care more and it doesn't help, but then you care more and it doesn't help. And then you...
I think that's sort of getting stuck in like the motivation paradigm. Like if I just wanted this so badly that I would forego like eating for 30 days to get this, then I will be able to cure my executive dysfunction.
And just to disprove that, because we can very easily disprove that, if you are here watching this stream right now or watching this as a video on demand later on or whatever, I promise you, you care a lot more about whatever it is that you're trying to do than all the other people you're comparing yourself to that you think, oh, they do this stuff without a problem. Are those people also taking time out of their day in their quote unquote free time to go watch a stream to get more information in order to try and adjust their behavior? So if that's the case, and you clearly already care more about it than the average person, but theoretically do it less than the average person, the only explanation then is either you have to say, oh, I have a deficit. I'm just bad in some inexplicable way that cannot be explained or accommodated for. Or maybe I have a misunderstanding. Maybe I believe something is true, which isn't true. Or I believe something isn't true, which might be. Or maybe there's something I'm missing. Which is why I don't just sit here and say like, no, you're wrong for thinking about it the way that you are, but instead focus on, here's why it's beneficial and valuable to think about it the other way. Right? We don't just say, stop beating yourself up. We talk about, here's why it's useful to pay attention to what it is you're doing, even if it is different than what you think would be ideal for you to do. Mm-hmm. We don't center the negative. And people will often walk away from meeting with me like, oh, Brandon just wants people to feel better about themselves, which is not true. I do want people to feel better for them, but that's not the point. It's utility. Feeling bad has not ever made anybody do anything any better. It does increase the value of a thing, right? It's in typical terms, it does increase motivation to do a thing if you feel bad. That doesn't matter if it's a thing you can't do. And even if it is a thing that you can do, then if the difference between you doing it or not is feeling bad, then it's not a thing that's worth doing given how much it costs you to do, unless you add on the extra incentive of feeling bad, which means the next time you're going to do it, you're going to also have to feel bad again and again and again. And you could look at lowering the cost instead so that it's still worth doing without having the extra I feel bad. So there's enough truth to this stuff to keep people stuck on this. If I just feel bad enough, then I'll do better. Mm-hmm. And you end up with people who get to places where they're in maximum burnout of literally like, you can't possibly feel worse and still continue to viably move from one moment to the next in your life.
Yeah.
And anything better than that is, oop, I'm slacking, I'm doing bad, I'm slipping, I gotta be mean to myself again. You can only ask for help when it's absolutely necessary or you will die. You can only have what you want when you're so miserable that if you don't get the slightest thing that you want, you will die, you know. It's terrible. And people have been convinced to think this way about themselves. So all I'm trying to say is a lot of it comes, here, I'll say this and we gotta go because I got a guy waiting, but nobody would argue if you're a bodybuilder and you're trying to pack on pounds and pounds of muscle, you're going to eat a lot more calories generally, but also a lot more protein specifically and electrolytes after workouts to replenish. So we all accept that if you behave in different ways, that you can deplete certain resources in your body or use certain systems in your body to the extent that you need to do unusual things that otherwise you wouldn't want that much protein, but in those times, in that context, you want it. Well, I just said earlier, but nobody clocked it, I bet, this way. What is the fuel source for cognition? Sugar.
Glucose.
You think that maybe there's a reason that there's a stereotype of people cramming in all-nighters and stuffing their face with gummy bears and other like pure sugary treats? That maybe in our modern day and age where many of us, pretty much all of us, but especially people who do intellectual labor and are trying to do it for some significant portion of the day, which is not a thing that we were evolved for. Of course, you're eating way more sugar than other people. That doesn't mean there's no downside, just like it's not like there's no downside to eating the way that a bodybuilder eats. But there are connections here. You can't just behave as though reality is different than what it is. Act as though you have more sugar in your system than you really do. You don't. You can't just think about things in a certain way and manipulate the reality of the physical universe. It's the most ridiculous wishful thinking, but it's what our culture teaches as a baseline. Yeah, it's like, no, if you just think about it, then you're able to run for 100 miles if you want it enough.
Yeah, if you want it badly enough, you'll do it. Yeah.
Brain's a physical system. You are a physical system. We're finite. Anyway, so pay attention. Hold on, real second. One second. I'll be right back.
Okay. Catch up with the comments.
I love these comments. They're so sweet.
Yeah, we like hanging out with you too. So
Yeah, it's really fun.
It helps.
I love the comments. Yeah.
Oh, me too. Hello.
Brandon's
gone party in the chat.
Sorry, my client was accidentally locked out. I just realized I wouldn't let him in, so he wasn't waiting in the hall.
This was so much fun. Yay.
Well, thank you. I forgot what I was going to finish up, but that's all right. Just, start, want to be more present in the moment. Start with, assume that any time that you were not thinking was a good time.
Mm-hmm.
You can use logic and reason, obviously, to deduce that that's not the case sometimes. Like, no, even though I wasn't thinking and paying much attention, that was a miserable experience. Great. But unless you can identify it that way, assume, no, that was a good thing. Don't call it shutting your brain up or doing anything to turn your thoughts off or whatever. Say, whatever I did pulled all of my attention to the physical environment. Just start by thinking of it that way, and you will automatically, you're already thinking about your stuff. You'll automatically start to put together some theories about what is the stuff that pulls my attention to the environment. Mm-hmm. And then, yes, like Caitlin was talking about earlier, that's when you start coming up with, okay, it seems like I'm really present in the moment when I have TV on in the background. So you start putting TV on in the background and see if it happens more. And if so, great. And if not, cool. And if you don't like something that you're doing that pulls your attention to the moment, then you don't have to use that particular thing, and we can come up with different theories. But it's still useful to have that information, because then we can say, okay, you don't want to have TV on in the background, but now we can look at what are the component elements of having TV on in the background that might be relevant here. Maybe it's something about the sound. Maybe it's something about the social data of having other people kind of present in a way to think about without actually needing to interact with them, or that they can observe you and respond. Whatever. Get that data. Get more data. Don't just keep thinking about the information you already have.
And we are sponsored by Rubik's Cube, and thank you for coming to the This Is Not Therapy Hour.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. I'm going to wrap us up with this comment. Listening to Brandon talk always makes me feel slightly better about my day, which makes it easier for me to do things.
Yay!
That's nice. And honestly, sometimes around here we'll talk about what we call like basic therapy. And basic therapy is that. It's like you've built up tension in your muscles over the course of the week, and you go to the masseuse or the massage therapist, and you get that. It doesn't like help you to do differently or make it so you're just as tense the next week and come back to the massage therapist to get it all worked out again. But that's basic therapy, and it's still helpful to just have something be a little bit easier, get a little bit, honestly, this is enjoyable. That means if it's enjoyable for you, that means that it is restful and recuperative, and it gives you a little bit more to do other things. Yes, we want to be able to take some of those extra resources and start to make changes, but sometimes you just need those extra resources to maintain what it is you're already doing, and at least you're not getting worse every week, or the extent to which it's getting worse every week is not as bad as it would otherwise be. Do what we can. Anyway.
Marie, can you ship me a loaf of your bread? This is me again trying to finish with a joke, and then Brandon's going to say, and by the way.
No, I promise I won't. I'm sorry.
I bake one about every 6 months, so.
You need to send one to Effective Artistry, and then we can eat your bread. It'll take like 10 days to get here. But
we'll ship Caitlin to Scotland is what we got to do.
Yeah, you'll ship me to Scotland. That would actually be, We're not allowed to say things like that. It would be so much fun.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
This was lovely. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Have a good rest of the day. Eat your feelings. Thank you for the
Eat
comment.
glucose. That is
Don't call it eating your feelings.
No.
You're eating and you're enjoying it.
You're
Nourishing your body.
unabashedly enjoying glucose.
You call it a bad
Yay.
thing, you remember it as a bad thing, you lose the data. All right.
Have a great rest of the day. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
So silly.